I will touch upon my new project of expressive sovereignty, which really evolved out of my research on Nahel Barrett, but center the main talk this afternoon on my observations as a sociologist working with planners and observing planners in their work as they engage in participatory practice in rebuilding Nahel Barrett, a refugee camp in the north of Lebanon. On May 20th in 2007, a small group of militants attacked an army post in Nahel Barrett, a Palestinian refugee camp in the north of Lebanon. 18 soldiers were killed in the course of the battle. The reprisal of the military resulted in 3 months of continuous bombardment that destroyed the entire camp. The short-lived war would change the lives of the camp residents forever. It not only deprived them of all their possessions, making some of them refugees for the fourth or fifth time, it also exposed the refugees to a multinational regime of military and humanitarian agencies that has held them hostage to the fallout of this incident ever since. 4 years into the reconstruction, only 30% of housing facilities that needed to be rebuilt had been completed, and only 60% of the population had been able to return. Finding their way back to normality is still nowhere near for large parts of the 30,000 refugees who were forced to flee. Reconstructing informal settlements is challenging under any circumstances. What makes matters particularly difficult for Palestinians is the fact that no one ever really fully documented the spatial syntax of the camp. Up until 2007, Nahel Barrett existed only in rough sketches on the map of UN agencies and governmental bodies. This has led a young team of architects and planners to join forces with the refugee population to map the camp at a level of detail so that it can be rebuilt just as it was before. The work of this grassroots initiative is unprecedented in Palestinian camps in Lebanon. It brought an undocumented chapter of Palestinian history into view that has set new standards for the way in which the evolution of the camps from a space to provide only temporary shelter into a permanent home is documented and accounted for. The lack of archival records has clearly demonstrated the critical significance of social and geographic data for political claim-making, in particular for those subjected to the augmented sphere of humanitarian governments. In Nahel Barrett, it became the primary means for renegotiating the material and political foundation of the camp's history and future. Yet at the same time, and in many respects because of that very reason, it also turned into a site of severe power struggles, as the old leadership guard of the camp, dominated by various political factions, saw its monopoly over the flow of information threatened, and sought to secure greater influence over planning decisions, but also over ways in which data was collected, validated, and processed into a new social and spatial reality. So what I want to do in this presentation this afternoon is to share some of my observations as a sociologist on the political economy of data in the planning process for Nahel Barrett. In doing so, I want to make a case why information management is of critical importance in participatory planning, in particular in informal settlements. I'm arguing here from a position in which planning is not only seen as a critical spatial practice, as a way of designing environments in ways that transform existing power relations. Planning, as I understand it here, is above all a critical informational practice, a way of organizing knowledge, the expertise of planners, the spatial intelligence of people, but also their historical imagination and their collective memory, in ways that open up new avenues through which this knowledge can enter into a productive conversation with the technocratic regime of governments, militaries, and humanitarian actors or donor agencies. The way in which planners bring all these sets of knowledge together and to interact have a critical bearing on the final outcomes and effects of their own ambitions, but also their work. My goal then is to shift our attention away to the flow of power in the knowledge exchange between local populations and planners, and to shift our attentions to the conversions that take place at the intersection of technical and social intelligence. I will not limit myself, if time allows, to the luxurious position of critique, but offer as a concept this idea of expressive sovereignty as a trope to expand our vocabulary of thinking and speaking about critical practice, so as to open up new rooms for maneuver for planners to support the needs of those living at the precarious intersection of formal exclusion and policed lawlessness. But let me start with a step back to history to explain why this relationship between data and sovereignty is so important and why it's relevant for architects. The Palestinian predicament extends far beyond the trauma of displacement, dispossession, and continuous occupation. It involves, above all, a radical rescripting of imaginative horizons, within which the history and presence of Palestinians is recorded, transmitted, and lived. Palestine, as a political entity and project, in many ways entered into the geopolitical sphere at the very moment of its own extinction. This not only pushed the Palestinian struggle from the beginning into a position of defensive, it established a situation in which the recognizability of Palestine as a subject of sovereign rights and claim-making remained structurally bound to the very forces responsible for its disappearance, destruction, and loss. Inflicted with this birthmark of an aborted nationalism, the struggle for self-determination found itself caught between imagining a Palestine that could have been, but never will be, and the difficulty to negotiate or come to terms with what it has become instead. Constructing histories, identities, and shared senses of belonging under such conditions is not only extremely difficult and challenging, it also remains bound to scripts and templates always laid out elsewhere, and here quite often by the very forces responsible for the disappearance from the geopolitical map. Attempts to escape the defensive logic inscribed into the project of Palestinian nationalism have so far not been very successful in producing lasting successes. Documenting the persistence of violence, loss, and destruction remains one of the few resources left for Palestinians to maintain visibility and recognition as a political address in the international sphere. This tragic entrapment in the frame of colonial logics, as Edward Said once argued, was one of the biggest achievements of Zionism. It was able to take hold of Palestine from within, making the native Palestinians seem like an outsider. Most of the time thereafter, the act of banishment has been the defining characteristic of existence for Palestinians. So what can self-determination mean for a people forced to maintain their sense of existence by mapping its slow death or gradual disappearance, and that is forced to exist or define itself out of disconnected fragments spread all over the world? Self-determination is only possible when there is a clear self to determine, Said responded. But the prolonged conditions of exile and dispersion make the problem immediately clear. To affirm a prior sense of belonging, a long historical patriation, has involved for us a prolonged denial of what we have become, disinherited outsiders. And the more we deny this, the more we confirm it, unless we cease being outsiders, Said said. What he points to here is a fundamental crisis of memory as a site of resistance and self-affirmation. This crisis not only manifests itself in the impossibility to bring back what was lost or to return to a state prior to the moment of forced displacement. It also involves the challenge of how to incorporate the multiplicity of spatial and temporal horizons and registers within which Palestinian histories and futures unfold and continue to be lived. The track record of Palestinian histories remains spread across a variety of archives, locations, and institutional databases controlled by actors and agencies over which the Palestinians themselves have little say. And it's here where the question of sovereignty becomes inextricably linked to the realm of data, knowledge, and informational resources. They provide the critical means through which individuals and collectives are able to maintain a positive presence by controlling the terms and conditions through which they become visible and recognizable as historical actors and groups. Yet, as the lack of proper documentation in Al-Barat clearly shows, the power to mediate the terms and conditions under which this becomes possible have so far been left by and large to humanitarian agencies, intergovernmental bodies, political negotiators, or academic researchers just like myself. Nahal Barat marks a critical turning point here, as there simply were no archival records to provide a comprehensive account of the past 60 years. And so, what initially might have seemed as a rather disastrous situation turned out to be an unexpected advantage in the end. A few words on the history of Nahal Barat. It's one of 12 camps here in Lebanon, established in 1949. I'm speeding up here. What you see here is the original area. This nut kind of shaped type structure is the historical structure of the camp as it was established in 1949. But this area, about 200,000 square meters, was soon not big enough to house the second and third generation of refugees. So people started to expand, first vertically by building up additional floors, and then horizontally by buying up land in the immediate area outside this natural structure. But most of these acquisitions of land were never officially documented. They were arranged through what is known as a power of attorney, which is a common legal arrangement here in Lebanon to obtain effective use rights without being formally registered as official owner of the land. The reasons why people did this are manifold. It enabled to save taxes or to avoid restrictions on the size of land one could own, and to be able to divide large plots into a number of different shares held by different shareholders, which also enabled to circumvent existing building codes. This, together with the fact that UNRWA only kept a partial set of records, has left the history of Nahal Barat largely undocumented, and created a situation in which the refugees had no official records at their disposal to reclaim the historical achievements of the past 60 years. This situation was further accelerated by the fact that in 2001 the property law in Lebanon changed such that Palestinians were no longer able to own property in Lebanon, which basically rendered all these legal arrangements invalid. They were no longer able to be or transformable into properly recognized, officially recognized sales contracts. This has left about 1,000 homes in the informal extension of the camp without legal protection and no mechanism available to reclaim formal recognition as rightful owners of their land. In the first 2 years, this lack of data, the precarious situation of the people, triggered an influx of hundreds of refugees, which exposed the camp population to an extensive overkill of research efforts. Various agencies knocked on their doors day after day, conducting one rapid needs assessment and vulnerability study after the other, which led the camp population to grow increasingly tired and impatient with this sudden overexposure to organized attention. And here it has to be said that the complaint over research and the lack of control of the information that is collected is a line of persistent critique resonating out of the camps. It addresses academic researchers, NGO researchers, but also governmental bodies alike, because people increasingly fail to see that this kind of research effort changed anything substantial in the conditions. So the standard line of critique you get is all this research only furthers your PhD careers, allows architects to write books, allows NGOs to secure budgets, but look at us, where are we? Nothing ever changes. So it's a very vulnerable and sensitive point for refugees, this rather exploitative structure under which academic research, but also NGO research takes place, where knowledge only seems to fly and flow in one direction, from the refugees into projects and budget pots of outsiders, but hardly anything is ever given in return. The young team of planners that joined forces with the refugees have always positioned themselves in marked difference to the knowledge practices of international NGOs and UNRWA. The collaboration between planners and the camp population was organized under the framework of a community-driven grassroots initiative. It called itself the Nahal Barat Reconstruction Commission and was pretty much organized as a network of networks, pooling existing resources from within the camp, stemming from various social neighborhood initiatives, but also the planning expertise of engineers within the camp, who throughout the years have organized their own infrastructure services, their own water networks, their own sewage systems, pooling these resources and linking it to the critical technical expertise of the planners was kind of the main idea to kind of strengthen the position of the refugees in its negotiation with vis-à-vis UNRWA, the Lebanese state, the military, to defend its interest and to reclaim authorship and ownership of the camp. So information was in many ways not only a critical resource, but a critical weapon to kind of reclaim control of the planning process. And it succeeded, because the Commission became in a position to be the leading partner of UNRWA in developing the master plan. And I can't go into detail here to describe all the processes in detail. Ismail mentioned it also this morning. The initiative coincided with a general shift in attitude among UNRWA, who realized that its top-down approaches to camp development do not work, and that there's an urgent need to include the local population in the management and planning of the camps. So there was an awareness also on the institutional level to actively engage the population and make it a constructive and productive part of the planning process. Yet there were many challenges ahead to meet these ambitions on the side of UNRWA and the Commission. One of the biggest ones was in fact UNRWA's own operational mandate itself. This mandate does not extend beyond the original historical borders of the camp, as established in 1949, which left the informal extension of Nahal Bared outside its formal area of responsibility without any institutional backup to secure funding or to negotiate the precarious legal situation of property ownership. All those homes built outside this official UNRWA mandate area are part of the local municipality and therefore subject to the sovereign responsibility of the state. And so while the old camp was it did not secure enough funding, but at least it had support of UNRWA in securing funding to rebuild this part of the camp, those outside this area of responsibility were pretty much left to themselves to find the money to rebuild their homes. The Commission has always made it a main point to support not least this part of the camp in its struggle and negotiations with the state. And information here was a critical force, because it not only documented who owned what and for how long, but also the conditions of houses. Yet several internal struggles within the Commission established a situation where in the very critical moment when these negotiations had to take place, confronting the private homeowners in the informal extension of the camp to enter into negotiations with the state on how to distribute funds and to whom, the Commission had reached a point of internal division where it was no longer operable, and the leadership had to step down. I just summarized the key reasons. I don't know if I can manage this. Yeah. Key reasons for the internal split is that the setup of the Commission and the fact that through the complicated and distributed situation of sovereign mandates forced the Commission to divide its attention between a formal collaboration with UNRWA and activist work on the informal extension of the camp, which kind of divided not only the attention of planners, but also energies and resources that could be spent on both parts of the camp, which made not only the vision to keep the camp as one special unit impossible, it also created a rift between those working closer with UNRWA and those left in the field office working closer to the community, which created lines of suspicion where some parts of the engineers felt kind of further away from key centers of decision making than others. It became a source of increasing tension, mistrust, and suspicion, which was not helpful to maintain and sustain a strong spirit of unity on the level of the engineers within this grassroots initiative. But there was also another problem, that with an activist component like this, you pretty much depend a lot on volunteer labor, on people investing a lot of free time and energy and resources to support the overall outcome to the benefit of the community. But once you realize that some people are kind of in a position to work across parts of the Commission were then outsourced to UNRWA to enter into paid relationships with the agencies, while another component of the Commission continued to work of volunteers. We created another source of mistrust and confusion about who's getting money for what and why are some paid and not others, which was also not very helpful in creating a strong spirit of solidarity across all levels of the hierarchy. And so in the end, you ended up having a lot of work done, a lot of valuable information collected, and yet in the very critical moment when this information was desperately needed, it was no longer available to the extent that it would have been required to negotiate in powerful and to confront the state as a unified front with a comprehensive set of data to defend the most vulnerable, in this case, part of the camp population, those who had been simply disappeared from the official national cadastre and were no longer recognized as official owners of the camp. And I think this is just one example I wanted to point out why information becomes a critical resource for sovereign claim making for a population that is left with little else than its memory to maintain its presence and visibility as historical actor and group, but also to maintain a position of being able to set the conditions and terms along which your life trajectory and your history and your future develops, in the absence of any other recourse to mechanisms of formal citizenship or full access to political and social rights. And so, as much as the effort of mapping the spatial history of the camp was able to achieve in terms of collecting critical information, in the end, the sad conclusion of the history of the Commission is that it fell short of utilizing this potential to its full extent, not least because it held on to a division of labor that left the exchange and the flow of information between the community and the planning regime within the Commission untouched. There was a gross imbalance built into the way in which investments of time and labor and the production of critical knowledge were rewarded and how the benefits of this labor were distributed and shared. This increasingly deprived the refugees over the control of one of their most precious resources, the track record of its own social intelligence and memory. It's quite interesting that the question of data ownership was always painstakingly avoided by UNRWA as well as engineers within the Commission itself. But it did not prevent individual actors to place exclusivist copyright claims on data provided by the refugees. Repeated attempts on my behalf to establish clarity on this matter triggered only contradictory responses. UNRWA was always keen to state that all information is public, is personal to each family, but will eventually be made public. Yet in each memorandum of understanding that defined the lines of collaboration with the engineers and planners from the camp, all rights to data and information products generated from the joint collaboration were assigned to UNRWA, the Commission, and after its breakdown to the Popular Committee. And I think it's here where some critical thinking needs to be done, whether this is really the way to go forward, or whether participatory planning should not pay more attention to how ownership rights over the data and knowledge created in the planning process is organized and secured to make sure that it's not only the planners but also the people themselves who have access and the skills available at their disposal. And here I found the legal workshops and the technical workshops very interesting, to make use of the information, which is, after all, not least the result of their collective efforts, the way in which they cope and engage with their environments to make the camps work. Collectively held knowledge is one of the most precious resources available to population who have little more than a memory to affirm their existence as political subjects. It provides a critical sphere of sovereignty in the realm of self-expression that enables those who have so far been deprived of the supreme authority to set the agenda of their existence to exert some form of agency and control over the ways in which they become visible, recognizable, and addressable as political actors and groups. And I just close with one sentence. This sovereignty is not just a matter of control for me, and I'm happy to respond further in the Q&A question. It very much includes also these fugitive forms of knowledge that were very nicely illustrated in the first lecture this afternoon, which is a knowledge that cannot be fixed, that defies to be fixed and linked to national identities and even local identities on the camp level. It's an emergent form of knowledge that only comes into being and only becomes recognizable as valuable through the way in which it's already applied as people go on and solve problems on their day-to-day basis. And I think that's another form in which expressive sovereignty opens up a space to think for planners how to mobilize these resources as an active force, as a productive component throughout the entire planning process, and here collaborative planning process, because it would involve to not make people kind of lay planners, but to find different ways of engaging with these emergent forms of knowledge, and to think of architecture really more along the lines as a knowledge practice and as a design of processes rather than built environments.